Good to see everyone this morning. It's good to see those who have been away visiting and traveling back safely with us. It's good. Those that have been sick and not able to be with us, we're thankful that some of them are able to be back. Let's continue to remember many in our prayers who need them for things going on in their life, both physically and spiritually, and trials and tribulations that they are experiencing. I appreciate Shane filling in for me last week. I appreciate him doing that while we were away in Virginia. We're ready this morning for verse 26. I'm not going to do a lot of recapping. We will be going over in a couple of verses. We'll be looking at the questions from the workbook, and I think that'll serve as a good reminder of verses 19 through 25. But this morning, I'd like to begin reading in verse 26, where it says, "If anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God and our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world." He says, if anyone thinks himself to be religious, the word religious is the Greek word threskos, and Thayer says it means fearing or worshiping God. So if anyone thinks himself to be a fearer of God, if anyone thinks himself to be a worshiper of God, and I dare say that all of us this morning would consider ourselves to be religious, to be worshipers of God, to be people who fear God. And so he says, if anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue. The word bridle is a long Greek word that I'm not going to try to pronounce because I'll mess it up if I do. Kalenageo, I think. It signifies, Vine says, to lead by a bridle, to hold in check, to restrain. And it's used metaphorically of the tongue and of the body in James 1, verse 26, and James 3, verse 2. So the idea of holding something in check, of restraining it, is the idea of bridling it. We're going to talk more about that in chapter 3. In fact, we may read over there in just a moment. Verse 19 of our study, we talked about being quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. There's the idea of bridling our tongue, being slow to speak, not being hasty. In chapter 3, verse 2, he says, "For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. Now, if we put the bits in the horse's mouth so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. Look at the ships also, though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, are still directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things." Skip down to verse 9. It says, "With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. Does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, and a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh." We're going to talk in great detail when we get to chapter 3 about sins of the tongue and ways in which we fail to bridle the tongue. It doesn't have to just be four-letter words, curse words, we call them, swearing. It can be literally swearing upon, by God or upon something of God's. It can be gossiping. It can be any kind of unwholesome language or speech that we read about over in Ephesians a couple weeks ago. Unwholesome words that don't edify, that don't give grace. There's angry words. Matthew chapter 5, we read about a brother calling his other brother a good for nothing or a fool. So there's a lot of ways that we can fail to bridle our tongues. And so he says, if anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, and we've talked about deceiving our own heart a couple times already, but in verse 22, he says, prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude or deceive themselves. So we talked about that phenomena where we somehow can think that just because we hear it, just because we know it, that somehow we're better off, even though we're not applying it, even though we're not obeying it. And when we do so, he says we're a hearer, we're not a doer, and we deceive or delude ourselves. Here he says when we fail to bridle our tongues, but yet we think we're religious, we deceive ourselves. What are we deceiving ourselves? We're deceiving ourselves into thinking that we're religious. Because we're about to find out what he says in the very next verse. The very next verse, what is he, or not the very next portion of the sentence, I should say. He says, this man's religion is worthless. Think about that for a moment. We all believe ourselves to be religious, to be worshipers of God, to fear God. And yet, he says, if we don't bridle our tongues, he says our religion is worthless, useless, of no account, profits us nothing. And you may ask yourself the question, why is that? Because, I'm doing all these things. I'm worshiping God. I'm here every time the doors open. I'm singing. I'm praying. I'm studying the Bible. I'm giving of my means. I am partaking of the emblems of the Lord's death. I am worshiping God. Why is it that my religion is worthless? Well, he says when we fail to bridle our tongues, it makes our religion worthless. Look over in chapter 2. And notice what he says beginning in verse 10. He says, for whoever keeps the whole law, and we talked about this a little bit last week. We talked about it quite a bit in our introduction to the book. But the law that he's talking about here is not the old law, the law of Moses. It's the law of Christ. Even though he references some things that are originally in the law of Moses, we studied and we talked about how Jesus reintroduced these same ideas in Matthew chapter 5 and added to them. But he says, for whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles in one point, he's become guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not commit murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do commit murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So I can be religious. I can be a worshiper of God. I can fear God to some extent, to maybe a great extent. And I can worship him perhaps to a great extent. And yet, if I fail to bridle my tongue, I am failing to keep all of the law of liberty, of Christ's law. And what does he say? He says, I become a transgressor, a violator of the law. And that is why our religion is worthless. And that really ought to, if there's one thing that we take away from this study this week and think about throughout the week, that ought to be it. That we must not just be hearers, but doers. God expects us to be doers, not just a part of it, not just a most of it, but all of it. Skip down with me to verse 14. He says, what use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but has no works? Can that faith save him? I want you to notice that we're talking here in verse 27 about deceiving ourselves by not bridling our tongues and it making our religion worthless. Here he's talking about faith. But notice the example that he gives in verse 15. If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? I can proclaim my faith all day long, and you know what? I can really believe in Jesus. I can believe he's the Son of God. I can believe he came to save me, to wash away my sins, to give me a home in heaven. But yet if I'm not acting in accordance with his law, notice what he says in verse 17, even so faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. Verse 18, but someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Verse 19, you believe that God is one, you do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? We have got to act upon our faith in the perfect law, the law of liberty. And part of that here in verse 27 or verse 26 of chapter 1 is bridling our tongues. Be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Chapter 3, he's going to talk extensively about the tongue and bridling it and the importance of bridling it, and the ways in which we can sin when we fail to bridle it. So if we think ourselves to be religious and yet we don't control, we don't restrain, we don't keep in check our tongues, our religion is worthless. It reminds me also of the statements that Paul makes over in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And in verse 3, he says, "And if I give all my possessions to feed the poor." What don't you think about that? We might give a great portion. We might give a great percentage, maybe in the collection plate on Sunday. We may give to a charity. But there's probably not very many of us or many people upon this earth that give all their possessions to feed the poor. And then he says, if I surrender my body to be burned, what a sacrifice. If there's a need, if there's an occasion, if there's a point to me giving my body, I do it. But then notice what he says, but I do not have love, it profits me nothing. My religion is worthless. Why? Because I fail to do things with the motive of love. Because I fail to bridle my tongue. Because I fail to care for others. Because I fail to keep the law. Matthew chapter 7. We're all familiar with this verse, but I want you to think about it as we read it. Matthew 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. But here's our word, he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. And notice verse 22, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Now, it could be that these people that he refers to here on the day of judgment who are making this statement in verse 22, it could be that they're deceived or they're deluded into thinking they did these things, but it doesn't really seem like that to me. It seems like these people actually did these things. To prophesy in his name, to cast out demons in his name, to perform many miracles in his name. They did these things, but then notice verse 23, and then I will declare to them, I never knew you, depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. We can be religious. We can do great things. We can do a lot of really good things. And yet we can fail to do all the things that the Lord would have us to do. And it profits us nothing. It's useless. It's worthless. This could have been said about Peter. Didn't Peter prophesy in the Lord's name? Didn't Peter cast out demons? Didn't Peter perform many miracles? And yet, what are we read about in Galatians chapter 2? Peter played the hypocrite. He would eat with the Gentiles, and then when the Jews came along, he withdrew himself, held himself aloof, played the hypocrite, and Paul rebukes him for it. Did all these wonderful things in your name, and yet I failed. I played the hypocrite. I didn't bridle my tongue. I didn't help the poor. And Jesus is going to say, depart from me, I never knew you, you who practice lawlessness. Any questions, any comments on this verse? It's really something that we need to think about. If anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle his tongue but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless. The next verse says, pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God, our God and Father, is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father. I think this statement indicates that man's idea of religion is often corrupted, isn't it? Because he's saying pure and undefiled religion as opposed to those who think themselves to be religious. Pure and undefiled religion, he goes on to tell us what it consists of. So in Colossians chapter 2, I think we see a good illustration of this principle of people thinking they're doing things to please God, and yet they're really not. In Colossians chapter 2, can't seem to find Colossians chapter 2, verse 20, He says, if you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of the world, why, as if you are living in the world, do you submit yourself to decrees such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which all refer to things destined to perish with use, in accordance with the commandments and the teachings of men. So the commandments and the teachings of men are saying, don't handle it, don't touch it, don't taste it. But notice what he says in verse 23. He says, these are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom in self-made religion and self-abasement and severe treatment of the body, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. There's a lot of people today in the religious world who substitute things, who substitute really the commandments and the doctrines, the teachings of men. It was the same problem that the Jews had. And Jesus rebukes them for continually during his ministry upon this earth, how that they were taking the doctrines and commandments of men and it made their worship vain. And he's talking about the same thing here. And he even acknowledges, he says, which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom and self-made religion and self-abasement and severe treatment of the body. People think, well, if I do this, then that'll make me a more pious person. It'll make me a more righteous person. If I abstain from this, it makes me think of practices such as Lent. You ever heard of somebody talk about observing Lent? And what do? They give something up for a period of time. Well, where's that commanded in the Scriptures? Where's the idea that giving something up for a certain period of time is going to help me in the future do the things that I need to do? So man's idea of religion and what we should do to be religious is corrupted. But he says pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God are the things that we're about to discuss. But remember in Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9, he says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways. As the heaven is high above the earth, so are my thoughts above your thoughts. So, we can think, oh, this is a good thing for me to do. It makes sense. It looks good. It sounds good. It has the appearance of religion. But it's not pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God. It's corrupted by man. And so he highlights two key areas of true religion. He highlights kindness, to visit, benevolence is another word, to visit orphans and widows in their distress. And then he mentions moral purity. He says to keep oneself unstained by the world. This is pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God our Father. So the word visit is the word epikatane. There's the word. You can pronounce it. I'm getting tongue twisted. But Strong says it means to inspect, that is, by implication, to select, by extension, to go, to see, to relieve. And so that's the way it's used here in this passage when it says to visit orphans and widows in their distress. To go see them, to relieve them, to see to their needs, to help them. And in the New American Standard Bible, it appears 11 times, and twice it's translated as concerned about. Once as select, that's there, I think, in Acts chapter 5 or Acts chapter 6 when they're appointing the deacons there at Jerusalem, and it says to go seek out or to find, the idea of inspecting or selecting men to take that office. 5 times it's the word visit, 3 times it's the word visited. And so it's the same word in Matthew 25 when we see the judgment scene where Jesus is on the throne and he's judging and he says, I was sick and you visited me. That's the word here. And then in verse 43, he says, sick and in prison and you did not visit me, to those on the left. So it's this idea of going and seeing, relieving, being concerned about their needs. Why? Because they're in distress. Orphans and widows are among the most abused and neglected classes of people that we see mentioned in the Scriptures. If you study the Old Testament very much, you see this phrase quite a bit, orphans and widows. It's some 24 times it's used. The word orphans is used 36 times. The word widows is used 87 times in the Scripture. And the first time we see it is in Exodus 22, verse 22, when the law is being given at Sinai. Part of it was, you shall not afflict any widow or orphan. Why? Well, they don't have parents. Orphans don't. And widows, especially a female widow, she doesn't have a provider. She doesn't have someone to care for her. And so they're very easy populations to prey upon. They're very easy populations to just ignore and neglect. But that oftentimes wasn't the case. People were actually taking advantage of them. And we see that today, don't we? How many spam calls or phony calls come through on our phones or emails, and they're trying to prey upon the elderly, or they're trying to prey upon people who are disadvantaged. And so people used to do this. And so a lot of times in the prophets, what we see is not only the heathen being rebuked for this, but God's own people being rebuked for their treatment of orphans and widows. And so James says we need to visit orphans and widows in their distress. So chapter 2 kind of segues into talking about dishonoring the poor in verse 6, under the context of being partial or playing favorites. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But this idea of visiting the orphans and widows in their distress, I want you to notice, and I think this is an important point to make, because it's my understanding, I didn't live through the 50s when the church split over human institutions. But it's my understanding that it was this passage that was often used as kind of the proof text for starting orphan homes, the church supporting orphan homes. I want us to notice that James is instructing individual action. And to help illustrate that, I want you to observe the uses of the following words in these 27 verses of chapter 1. We see 4 times the word you is used. We see 4 times the word one in the sense of a person, this one or that one. We see oneself here in verse 27, to keep oneself unstained by the world. He says anyone 3 times, again, individual. He says everyone once. He says he 12 times, speaking of an individual. He says him twice, speaking of an individual. He says himself twice, speaking of an individual. He says his 8 times, again, speaking of an individual. And then man, an individual, 9 times in 27 verses. And I may have left some out. I may not have counted them all. But that's what I came up with. And so it's very difficult as you read down through here from verse 1 to verse 27 to come away with the idea that James is instructing church action here. No, James is instructing individual action. He wants me to consider it all joy when I encounter various trials. He wants me, if I lack wisdom, to pray for it in verse 5. He wants me to humble in my high, or rather to glory in my high position as a Christian, and to not become disappointed or to become frustrated that others have more than I have, realizing that, the rich are passing away. Verse 12, he says, blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown. Is that talking about the church? That once the church has persevered under trial, that it will receive? No, he's talking about a person that endures or perseveres under individual trials. That once he has done this, once he has been approved, he'll receive the crown of life. He's telling me not to lust. He's telling me where lust comes from. He's telling me to be quick to hear and slow to speak and slow down. He's not telling the church to do that. He's telling individuals to do this. And so just over and over again, he's talking about receiving the word and planted. Is he talking about the church? No, he's talking about individuals receiving the word and planted, humbly receiving it and letting it change their lives so that they are doers of it and not just hearers. He talks in verse 25 about looking intently at the perfect law of liberty. He's talking to me and you as individuals. And then in verse 27, pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So it's very difficult to read these 27 verses. It's really difficult to read the whole book of James and come away with the idea that he's speaking here about church action, something that we are to do collectively. It's true in chapter 2, in verse 2, that he mentions the assembly. But as we go on and we read, what is he talking about? He's talking about the way we act as individuals in the assembly, how we treat those who are rich and those who are poor, how we might say, sit by my footstool. Well, is that the church's footstool? No, that's my footstool. I'm telling a person to sit in the floor because you're dirty and unkept, and I'm giving the rich man, the man with a ring and a fine apparel, I'm giving him the best place to sit. That's something I do. And on and on and on we go. We see this. He's talking to individuals about guarding their tongues. And so it's very difficult to read this passage and come away with the idea that what he's instructing here is for the church to visit orphans and widows, and thereby giving the church authority to use the collection to help human institutions, whether it's a separate human institution or whether it's a human institution the church sets up to go about doing this work. It's difficult to understand how someone could walk away from this passage, and the truth of the matter is it says an element of what they want it to say, and they use it as the proof text to do what it is they want to do. But what we see is there's a difference between the acts of benevolence or charity or kindness, whatever you want to call them, that the church and the individual are authorized to perform. The church, and I don't know why this thing keeps clicking 2 instead of 1. I'm going to have to be careful. The church, in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, we see what the church is authorized to do. Turn there. We talked about this, what was it, last year as we were studying the book of Corinthians. In chapter 16, verse 1, he says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints." Who is it for? The world? No, he says the collection for the saints. As I directed the churches of Galatia. Who's he talking to? He's talking to the church at Corinth. He's given the example of having spoke to the church of Galatia. The church is of Galatia. "So do you also on the first day of every week. Each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collections be made when I come." So here's a collection, but what's that collection for? It's for the saints. Turn over to 2 Corinthians. Here he is kind of admonishing them to do what it was they set about to do originally in chapter 8 and verse 4. And he's talking about the churches of Macedonia in the context. But notice he says, begging us with much urging for the favor of participation in the support of the saints. Not in the support of the world at whole, but of the saints. And then again, in chapter 9 and verse 1, he says, "For it is superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints." Very clear, very explicit. And then again in verse 12, he says, "For the ministry of this service is not only fully supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing through many thanksgivings to God." 4 times we have him specifically talking about the collection, the ministry, the caring of, not the world at large, not the poor at large, but of the saints, of needy saints. We see an example of that. We see it illustrated for us in Acts chapter 11. You remember there, Barnabas is working with the church at Antioch. And he leaves Antioch. He goes to Tarsus. He finds Saul in verse 25. And it says, "For an entire year," in verse 26, "they met with the church and taught considerable numbers, and the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch." He says, "Now at this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine all over the world. And this took place in the reign of Claudius. And in the proportion that any of the disciples had means, each of them determined to send a contribution for the relief of the brethren living in Judea. And this they did, sending it in charge of Barnabas and Saul to the elders." So here we see an example of the church collecting for the needs. Again, what does it say? Relief of the brethren living in Judea. But who's the famine affecting? Who is it impacting? Back up in verse 28, he says there's going to be a great famine all over the world. Did they send a collection to people all over the world? No, it said they sent it to the brethren living in Judea. And so here we see it an example of how the church acted to help the saints that were in need. But now notice how the individual can act. Here in our text, in James chapter 1, verse 27, we talked about he's talking to individuals here. He tells me that if I think I'm religious and yet I don't bridle my tongue, I deceive my heart. It makes my religion worthless. But pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their distress and to keep myself unstained by the world. To keep ourselves unstained by the world. Or oneself, rather. So this is an individual action. to visit the orphans and the widows in their distress. In chapter 2, and in verse 15, we read this a moment ago. If a brother or sister is without food and in need of daily, or without clothing and in need of daily food, and he uses the illustration how you just say, well, I hope you get what you need, slap them on the back, I'm thinking about you, praying for you, but yet we don't lift a finger to give them what it is they need, which is clothes and food. He said, what use is that? And he compares that to faith without works, and he says it is useless or dead being by itself. So here we see an individual action that we must take to help see the needs of those. In chapter 2, obviously he's talking there about brethren. But in Matthew chapter 25, we referred to this a moment ago at the judgment scene. Jesus is praising those who he said visited him. Let me just go over there and read it instead of trying to paraphrase it. In Matthew 25 and verse 35, he says, for I was hungry. Matthew 25, verse 35, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. Naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. And then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? Verse 39, when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? The king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. Is Jesus judging the church here? No, Jesus is judging an individual here. And he's judging them upon the basis of, did they provide need to brethren when they had it? He says, even the least of them. However you want to define least. Is that the poorest? Is that the weakest? Is that the youngest? Is that the least popular? Whatever. He says, when you did it to any of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, he said it was though as you did it to me. So here we see that as individuals, we have a need to help, specifically in the context here, brethren. But turn with me to Galatians chapter 6. Again, it's very clear from reading just beginning in verse 1, he says, brethren, if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself so that you too will not be tempted. Who's he talking to? He's talking to individuals. I have an obligation when someone is erring to go to them to try to turn them back. I have an obligation to bear my brother's burdens. I have an obligation to bear my own load. Verse 5. I have an obligation to teach others. Verse 6, to help others. Whoever taught the word is to share all good things with the one who teaches him. To support those who teach. I'm not to fail to realize the law of harvest. For what I reap, or rather what I sow, I'll reap, he says in verse 8. He tells us not to lose heart in doing good. And then in verse 10, he says, so then, while we have an opportunity, let us do good to all people. Individual action. I have an obligation as a Christian to help all people. As I have opportunity, he says. And then he says, and especially to those who are the household of faith. So again, I hope we're seeing here the difference between what we read about the church doing with its collection, which was always specified for the saints, for the brethren, versus what I as an individual am allowed to do, but not only allowed to do, obligated to do. And that's to help all as I have opportunity. And then in Hebrews, finally, and there's other passages we could look at, but these are just a few that I thought of. In Hebrews 13, he says, let love for the brethren continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember the prisoners as though in prison with them, and those who are ill-treated, since you yourselves also are in the body. Again, individual obligation that I have to help those in need, both saints and non-saints. The church, however, doesn't have the authority or the obligation to help those outside the church. Only those who are within, only those who are saints, only those who are brethren. Any questions, any comments on this point? And then finally, as part of this pure and undefiled religion, he says, I'm to visit the orphans and the widows, but I'm also, he says, to keep myself unstained by the world. Remember back up in verse 21, he says, put aside all filthiness, all that remains of wickedness. I put all that aside. I've got to be morally pure. I've got to be unstained by this world. In chapter 4, in verse 4, he says, "You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." That's why I must remain unstained by the world. Because if I'm seeking to make friends with this world, he says I am making myself an enemy of God. And then we've read this passage several times at different points in our study, but in 1 John chapter 2, "Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him." We may deceive ourselves into thinking that it is. But if we love the world, he says the love of the Father is not in us. All that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. The world is passing away, also its lust, but the one who does the will of God lives forever. We must keep ourselves unstained from the world. That's what it means to practice pure and undefiled religion. Any questions, any comments on these two verses? Okay. Let's look at the questions in the workbook on page 98 and 99. I think it's a good recap of what we've studied so far, going back to verse 19. So the first question is, what did James exhort every man to do? Verse 19. Absolutely. What conflicts with the righteousness of God? Somebody? Anybody?
Wrath of man.
The wrath of man, the anger of man, does not achieve the righteousness of God. Verse 20. What should we lay apart? Verse 21. All filthiness, all that remains of wickedness. Got to put that aside. Verse 4. What is able to save our souls? The Word of God, the Word implanted. Verse 21. We're to humbly receive it. And it's able, it says, to save our souls. Verse 5, question 5. One who hears the word but does not obey it is likened to what? That's right, verse 23. And it says, what does this man forget? He answered that, what kind of person he was. He forgets what he looks like. Number 7 says, into what does the man who is blessed look? He looks into the perfect law of liberty, verse 25. Number 8, what more must one do than simply look? Right. He's not to be forgetful. He's to be an effectual doer, verse 25. Number 9, what is the real condition of a religious man who bridles not his tongue? Hopefully that one's fresh in our minds. That's right. This man's religion is vain. This man's religion is worthless. It's useless. It's of no benefit. What is involved in religion that is pure and undefiled? There's 2 things: to visit orphans and widows and to keep oneself unstained by the world, verse 27. True or false? One who hears the word is blessed for that alone. That's false. We got to act. We got to do. The wrath of man works the righteousness of God. That's false. How we talk does not affect our relationship with God. That's also false, verse 26. Being unspotted from the world is necessary for pure religion. That's true, verse 27. And one can seem to be religious, but be in a lost condition. That's true. So research, he says, what is the engrafted word and the perfect law of liberty? It's the gospel, that's right. So both reference the gospel, the revealed word of God or will of God, the law of Christ, the new covenant, whatever you want to call it. They're the same thing. And I want you to notice that James uses several descriptions of the same thing interchangeably in the context. He calls it the word of truth in verse 18. In verse 20, he calls it the righteousness of God. And we may not naturally associate that with the word of God, but that's what Romans chapter 1, verse 16 does. It says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And then the very next verse, verse 17, says, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. And so they're the same thing. The righteousness of God is the word of God. It's contained not what God does to be righteous, but what we must do to be righteous in the sight of God. The word implanted, he says in verse 21. In verse 22, he simply calls it the word, and then he calls it the word again in verse 23. And then finally in verse 25, he calls it the perfect law, the law of liberty. And we didn't talk about this a whole lot 2 weeks ago, but we did in our introduction. We can turn back over to Galatians where we studied in months past, and we can see that he talks about the law of Christ, and he talks about, Christ set us free. Why do we want to go back into bondage? We are to follow the law of Christ, Paul says. And so the perfect law, the law of liberty, is interchangeable with the law of Christ, because it was his law that set us free from the old law, set us free from sin. Any other questions or comments on that one? So the thought question, he says, does James 1:27 authorize the church to build and maintain benevolent institutions? And explain. Definitely not. And I hope that what the verses that we looked at, the points that we made, help us to see that and understand that. So I just copied this from what we looked at on the previous chart. But all these words that he uses here, these pronouns in some cases, these descriptions, he's talking about individuals. And so when he gets to verse 27, he's still talking about individuals, that you and I have an obligation to visit orphans and widows. This isn't church action. He's not telling the church to go out and build an orphan home. He's not telling the church to go out and support an orphan home. He's telling you and me to do that, to help, to visit them. Whether that's individually, we know of a widow, and so we go and we visit her and we help relieve her needs, or whether it's orphans that we know about and we help supply their needs, or whether we donate our money to a charity, and hopefully when we do so, we're very careful about what charities we donate to help those in need. But that's very different from the instructions that he gave the church. The church, he always instructed to help saints or brethren or disciples. So I hope that that's clear. So next week we'll begin in chapter 2.